Hello and welcome to After the Homily with Father Daniel Schiedt. I'm Dr. Chris Stroud. Have you ever had questions after the homily? I know that I have. Have you wished that the priest would talk about this topic or that topic, or have you argued about why he didn't talk about this topic or that topic? Well, this is the podcast for you. We cover everything from literature to politics, from church teaching to church architecture. And it doesn't matter if you're a everyday or I can't remember the last time I went to Mass Catholic. We're here, and this podcast is for you. Father Daniel Schiedt is the pastor of St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. Father Dan, it's good to be back.
Great to be here, Chris.
This is our third, we think maybe, of 3 episodes on a journey to November 6th and the presidential election, although I think all of our material is really applicable to school board elections or the county seat. Or
Yes, it's designed to be perennial rather than in view of just one day.
And we hope that viewers, that you'll go back and watch episode 1 and episode 2, but these are standalone, but we think that you would enjoy the other episodes as well. But in the very first episode, you took us way back to Plato and some time in a cave with shadows on the wall, and you inspired us that we have to recognize we're just watching shadows and decide that we want more.
It's very tempting to make politics a religion, which is to say to trap ourselves in the intra-mundane, the this worldly, and to lose sight of the more primordial and life-changing fact that the true election is our own being elected by God in Christ to become saints and to exercise our agency, our citizenship in and from and for heaven. So it's just to say that if we don't have that in mind, we will just be arguing in the echo chamber of the cave, and we won't get out. Fortunately, blessedly, Christ himself has penetrated that domain, made it his own, and made us active participants in his election of the world to be redeemed.
And I thought you made a very important point that I don't recall hearing before in that first episode, and my words, not yours, but essentially you said to vote in civil elections is not separate from our work, so to speak, or our journey as Christians, but it's an extension of it, and an important one.
Exactly. Yes, it's a moral obligation to discern and to choose those who will be the best stewards of our shared life, the common good. Now, it's true that in elections, oftentimes, because the candidates are so impoverished in any number of ways, that one winds up voting against the perceived greater danger. But even in that case, it has to be done based on a prior discernment of the greater good.
And you had some important advice in that first episode, and that was decrease our consumption by 90% of all things news.
Yes, and to take that extra time and to allow ourselves to enter the Lord's good news on his terms, so that we can have a much more radically contemplative attitude rather than one in constant fight or flight mode and one crushed by despair.
Yeah, every time I've looked at my device since that episode, I've heard you in my ear saying 90%, 90%. That's quite a challenge.
Yes, it's liberating, though.
And then in our second episode, we took a little bit of a different path, and we spent some time in a book by Jonathan Haidt, that's H-A-I-D-T, and where I would call that book, and your description of it, trying to help us get along with our relatives.
How to understand where other people are coming from, and some of the deeper, even pre-rational desires that are being expressed. it spares us from demonizing other people because of whatever choices they make, and thereby holding ourselves hostage to other people's perceived stupidity.
And I felt like in some ways there was an implied assumption of good in the parties, as opposed to one good, one bad,
Yes.
but differences in the parties. And the one that stuck with me when you were describing the 6 axes, I think was, if you're dealing with a person whose fundamental importance is freedom and the other one is safety, they're not going to see eye to eye, but neither are demons.
Right. So the point would be, if we don't seek to understand the deeply human motivations shaping people's choices, we will be tempted to demonize them and to reduce them to a caricature, and that's when social interaction breaks down, and then in that case, we're just dealing with a world of alienation and power politics where might makes right.
I mean, a common phrase I think we'll hear people say is, we need to agree to disagree. And after that discussion, I sort of came away with, we need to learn to disagree, not agree to disagree, because we're not very good at that as a people anymore.
Well, we're also growing in our understanding of our own temperament and where we're coming from, and the strengths and perhaps unintentional biases that we may also be bringing. All of us are human beings, and it's not to go the direction of relativism, that there actually isn't a more excellent choice, but rather to understand that there are good motivations behind most people's decisions regarding the good of society, even if those need to be refined, even corrected.
Well, and that brings us to this, our third in our journey to November 6th. So now we've prepared the way, or you've prepared the way. How will you lead us today?
Sure. I'm hoping to propose 5 principles of discerning, not just individual candidates, but one might also use these principles to discern party platforms or large cultural trends that are carrying or carried by particular aspirants for public office. And I'll just state them right off the bat and then just go through them one by one, because they really are in a particular order of importance.
But, you remind me, in case viewers didn't see the last episode, I thought you did a really interesting contrast between principles and values last time. You just said we're going to do 5 principles, but maybe a quick recap.
Yes. Oftentimes the word values is used as a substitute for principles, with the tacit admission that, there really aren't objective criteria of discernment. It all comes down to what you value, what I value, and in this dichotomy of values versus principles, values would be subjectively what I bring in terms of emphasis or advocacy, and principles would be objective. Those would be truths, ideas that shape my discernment, regardless of my subjective responses or my particular temperament. So today we're really going to focus on objective truths, which is to say principles rather than values.
Ah, excellent. And away we go.
Here we go. So the 5 are the truth, human life, the family as the fundamental cell of society, intermediate institutions, especially when that comes to the principle of subsidiarity, which groupings of people are best equipped to deal with which challenges. And then the final would be the principle of the church herself. That is to say, the body of Christ, the membership drawn into this holy communion that is to be in the world, but not of the world, and existing for the salvation of the world. But I wanted to start with the truth, because that is actually the most important principle. The truth is the mind's correspondence to the real. So the truth is when what's in our intellect matches, corresponds, or we could even say adequates what is actually the case outside of the mind. So St. Thomas Aquinas would describe it as the adequation. The truth is the adequation of the mind to the real, which means that our mind is always in need of growing in the truth, investigating the truth, and once we find aspects of the truth, seeking to find even more facets of the truth. And the alternative to that would be, of course, the lie, which is to say, to oppose one's mind to the truth, or to deceive other people regarding what one knows to be the truth. And that culture of reflexive lying has really poisoned the national discourse.
Sure. Yeah, so the disregard for truth.
Outside of the truth, one is left with anarchy, and anarchy is inherently destructive. So it leads to the disintegration of society. So, for example, on the criterion of the truth, one can ask the question, does a particular candidate for public office reflexively lie? That is to say, when confronted with difficult truths that might not correspond to what this particular candidate might want, does the candidate just as a reflex deny reality and assert the contrary to it? And one can also add, in recent times, when it comes to those who hold public office and are challenged by whatever form of decline, is that being communicated to the public in a way that the public can have confidence in the elected leadership to govern the nation? So it's one thing to ask about the truth in terms of a particular person and a person's character. It's also important to be asking the question of truth when it comes to the very group of people in the exercise of governance. And if there is systematic lying about who's governing the nation, that is to be taken with utmost seriousness, because without the integrity of leaders actually leading, again, we're faced with the possibility of just chaos and nobody at the wheel.
In the moment, in technology and media being what it is, it's very popular to fact check. And now there are professional fact checkers. And at first glance, I think you would think, well, that'll solve the problem. We'll just fact check what you said, and I'll show that it's wrong, and that's that. But it's even more complex, I think.
Yes, it is. And you bring up an excellent point that in the discernment of truthfulness, it's not simply a question of discerning the truthfulness of a particular candidate or a particular group of people who may have the stewardship of the highest offices of the executive branch, but it's also a question of the truthfulness of those whose task it is to communicate the truth about the political realm. And I think on the one hand, we live in a climate where ordinary traditional media outlets have abandoned the aspiration to objectively presenting reality in its complexity and have devolved into just partisan, which is to say, one-sided characterizations that are composed to further their own advantage, and selectively leaving out difficult truths. So, for example, in reporting on the current presidency, there seems quite clearly now to be a certain media cover-up of the debility of the current president, and at the service of advancing a particular agenda. Now, the flip side of this is that there have sprung up, almost overnight, a whole plethora of other platforms and people who are looking for more than what the traditional media outlets are offering.
Sure.
And I think the way to navigate those is precisely through variety. So rather than relying entirely on one source or another source as the go-to ones that confirm my deeply held views, to have a certain variety in attending to people who bring a probity of thought and also a desire to understand the complexity of reality, not to reduce everything to a cartoon or a slogan or a soundbite. That's how we navigate the truth.
I mean, I think we've heard these debates on the major news outlets about, journalism versus sort of opinion. And I'm old enough to remember a little bit Walter Cronkite and Peter Jennings and some of the greats of mainstream media. And it's hard to imagine some of them would have ever said the things that we routinely hear on a lot of different outlets or if someone had said something that was clearly inconsistent with truth, that would have been challenged on it. But we don't hear that very often now.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. And other podcasts go into much more detail about this. I would simply say that for our purposes, it is most important. It is the most important principle that we are relentlessly focused on the truth, the adequation of our mind to what is, and to be suspicious of those persons and groups of persons who are lying in a way that would imperil the republic. I should also say that democracies don't lend themselves well to truth-telling. Why? Because democracy is the will of the people, not necessarily the intellect of the people. And so whether it's political parties or candidates, it's a constant appeal to the emotions. If one saw the political conventions, it's all about the vibe. It's all about stoking the appropriate fears and creating the appropriate feel-good mood to persuade people that the feel-good mood is the good, and whoever stokes the most fear is pointing out what's the most bad. The relentless dedication to the truth is going to cut through that.
You sound a bit like a commercial for Hillsdale College. That's their logo.
I actually think that, for example, the materials that Hillsdale puts on its website, the courses in the founding documents of our nation,
which are free, by the way.
Exactly. Yeah. So in the 90% of one's ordinary news consumption that is saved by not just getting on that hamster wheel of indignation, to spend a portion of that extra time actually studying the founding documents and for example, exploring how the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, were actually designed to put the brakes on somebody who would aspire to be a demagogue rather than a statesman, or how the different branches of government cooperate in thwarting the dominance of any one of those. And that study is going to be vital in discerning who is actually most going to stabilize things in the current moment of the democracy. And, we actually have the experience of both candidates in the 2024 election for the presidency having served in that high office, either as president or as vice president. So in one sense, the two are more known quantities than in other elections.
Let's say there's plenty of data available.
Correct.
If you can find it from a reliable source.
Yes, sources.
Correct. So the first criterion for this discernment is a relentless seeking of the truth.
Of the truth, which gets us to the most fundamental of truths, namely, what is a human being and what protections of a human being's life merit legal protection. Not as if the government confers those rights, but rather the government rightly recognizing the humanity of these human lives. And so we actually do have to explore the truth of whether the dignity and integrity of a human life depends on its geographical location, for example, in the mother's womb or outside of the mother's womb. We actually have to get to the truth of whether the dignity and integrity of a human life depends on its chronological age. So several days after conception, several months in the womb, several minutes after passing through the birth canal, several years after being outside of the mother's body entirely. And you obviously are in a position to speak to that as an obstetrician. And then, does the dignity and integrity of a human life depend on whether that life is wanted or not wanted, intended or not intended, whether it's too small, whether it has recognizable features that would stimulate our empathetic response or not. Are any of those factors existentially relevant to what that human life is? And ultimately, human life begins at conception. That's not primarily a theological truth. That is primarily a scientific fact.
A mammalian biology. It's not complicated.
There you have it. And so when one examines the stance of a particular candidate or a particular political platform, one should pay closest attention to who is considered in when it comes to human lives being protected in law, cherished in love, and who is considered out. And I think it's fair to say that in our nation, one symptom of the cultural instability and the disintegration of persons and relationships, families, is that many Americans are not persuaded that human lives are in need of legal protection in the womb. And obviously there's a whole spectrum there, ranging from what about situations where there is a birth defect, what to do in situations like that, versus situations where abortion is simply used as birth control. But the fact that we've reached the point where outside of a political convention is the Planned Parenthood van dispensing free extermination of human lives and then mutilation of bodies to render them purposefully infertile, that should factor into our decision about who can be entrusted with the care of the next generation of human beings. And I should also point out that as things become less stable politically, that's a reflection of things becoming less stable in people's personal lives. So, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the notion of our embodiment being so radically called into question, the binary of male and female. And for example, for a president, in this case was President Biden, to say that the transgender issues are the civil rights issue of our time. And by that, he means the further reduction of our embodiment to our technologized choices. So in other words, to claim that human beings have a right to chemical, surgical, mechanical mutilation of otherwise perfectly healthy, functioning organs of their body. The fact that would be considered not just an option, but aggressively pushed as normative in law, that is an enormous social experiment that has really dramatic social consequences.
I think it's interesting that we would be sort of linking those two. We're talking about life and is it an embryo and when is it a human? And in the same sort of thought, we're talking about a transgender issue, but they really are linked. It's about
intrinsically, and this is the point. Yeah. So the point is, these are not isolated issues. It's a question of human autonomy, auto meaning self, nomos meaning law. It's a question of human autonomy seen as, conceived as, no pun intended, technologized individualism. In other words, I have a right to enforce my will using whatever tools modern science may come up with to get what I want because it's my body. And everyone else has to accommodate my imperial will.
Including changing their language.
Exactly. Or being canceled. So this nexus of life issues is it's quite complex in its interrelationship. I mean, just to give one fascinating example that's not often made, the connection between human ecology and what we can call like environmental ecology. So the claiming of the right to take hormones to render oneself infertile, and granted, there are hormonal therapies that are medically necessary, as you know. So it's not speaking against those, but a culture that considers it normal to take an otherwise healthy, functioning human body and to introduce more hormones into that. Well, when those hormones get excreted and enter the water system and can't be filtered out at the waste treatment facility, and we have all sorts of birth defects in wildlife, in fish, and the different varieties of cancer like are multiplying. It should give us pause to return to what human health, what human life looks like, and for Catholics, it does mean coming to terms with the fact that these stances will not always be politically popular. In fact, it'll be regularly ridiculed and marginalized. But these remain the objective criteria of discernment. And so, given the fact that both party platforms have now caved, one has consistently pursued the culture of death in terms of these issues of conception and the carrying of human life, and the other has become a cultural weather vane. Again, the discernment is, well, among the two failures, which one is the least egregious?
On matters of life.
Yeah. But again, this brings us to the third.
But, just before you leave the life, I thought of something that I know personally I've often been accused of overemphasizing the examples that you gave.
That's right.
We're talking about abortion and when does human life begin. And those, my opponents would have said, yes, but you don't care anything about poor people. Or
yes.
You don't care about the baby after it's born.
Yes.
Could you speak to that a little?
Yes. And you teed it right up because let me offer another standard critique that the Catholic Church is just so over-focused on pelvic issues. Like, why just those? Because the future of the human race, the bonding of men and women, the conceiving of the next generation passes necessarily by way of the pelvic issues.
That it does.
And so the third criterion is actually the family as the primary cell of society, which is to say the union of man and woman as husband and wife for life being the central criterion by which laws should be favoring certain types of union and at the very least not legally favoring other types of sexual expression. And obviously there's the whole spectrum of, well, what should be legal, what should be illegal, et cetera, et cetera. But the third principle that I would articulate regarding the family is that every single human being deserves to be conceived within the context of a man and a woman lovingly united to each other in marriage for life. So cultures that invest in that, despite the 10,000 failures associated with that aspiration, cultures that invest in that flourish. Cultures that do not invest in that, and in fact, pass legislation granting a kind of normativity to any mode of conceiving human beings on any terms, that leads to civilizational collapse, which gets us to the question of the poor. So oftentimes, poverty is presented as simply a lack of material wherewithal for life, or a lack of social opportunities. And the looking at family integrity is considered to be an embarrassment. So when we're dealing with a situation in which more than half of children who are conceived and allowed to live, so we're not even talking about those aborted away, but just more than half of them conceived are being conceived in the volatility of unions where the mother and the father of these children, biologically, genetically, are in fact not united in a partnership of love, marriage. That is devastating to communities, and it perpetuates and exacerbates the poverty. There was an author whose name currently escapes me. In the early 1930s, he wrote a large book called Sex and Culture, and he studied over 80 civilizations in world history. And he wasn't a Christian, not a person of faith at all, and he came to the conclusion that in every single human culture on the planet that stepped back from promoting chastity before marriage, that is to say, creating by a combination of legal privileging of marriage and all sorts of social customs that would support the discernment of men and women in the union of marriage. Cultures that stepped back from that regressed and ultimately failed. Cultures that succeeded for however long a time at fostering the, shall we say, the domestication of the sexual instinct in this bond of male and female flourished. And so when we ask questions, for example, like, well, what about the migration of people, and why are the different populations on the move, and what to do about that? In most parts of the world, we're in a situation of fewer human beings being born than the replacement level of the population needs. And so you're getting more and more people as they age, drawing on more and more social services, and fewer young people contributing to the welfare of the earlier generations. And that creates like major disruptions, and also furthers the instability of whole nations. It is to say, the instability that we see in the family today is being played out on the global stage in these situations of migration. I'll just give one example from our own parish. We twin with a parish in Honduras, and the former pastor of that parish, a dear friend of mine, shared with me that all of the men of his parish in the mountains of Honduras are tempted to come to the United States for work, ostensibly to support their families. They wind up staying in the United States and abandoning their families. So it creates this vicious cycle of poverty where men have abandoned the marriage bond in one country because of the limited job situation, and then that just ripples in all sorts of ways you might imagine. So when it comes to migration policy, every living organism needs to keep the good in, and to keep what's outside of it that needs to be kept out, and most importantly, needs to regulate the back and forth. Because an organism that only keeps what it considers good dies. An organism that's just wide open to everything dies. It disintegrates. The living organism that is able to modulate the back and forth, and this is where Catholic social teaching on migration comes in. Every nation has a sovereign right and duty to maintain the integrity of its borders, and also to foster the integration of people in its customs, laws, and mores. At the same time, every nation has to be open to the flow of the back and forth of people. And in fact, our own nation is premised on exactly this this openness to welcoming people and receiving the good things that they have to give, and that being a benefit for the rest of the world. So, this third principle of the family as the principal cell of human society, those candidates and those party platforms that best support the we can call it the traditional family, and by that I don't mean the nuclear family of just husband, wife, child in isolation, but rather this multi-generational fidelity that conceives children and rears children in the loving union of husband and wife for life. Those candidates and political parties that foster that vision of traditional family life need to be supported, and those that are hostile to it and that try to come up with alternatives to it really need to be resisted for the survival of civilization.
I mean, it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that Marxist-type regimes through history have been anti-family, anti-church, anti-family.
Yes, and that gets us to principle number 4. We can call it the principle of intermediary institutions. And by that I mean all of those connected groups of human beings that exist beyond the family and the state. So, every state has the right and the duty to organize its people. So again, think of a living organism. But with Marxism, the state becomes the church. And even more perniciously and accurately, in traditional Marxist thought, it's the perpetual revolution. So it's the dismantling of the structures of ordinary family life, of ordinary exchange of goods, and this constant turning and churning of the laboring multitudes to get the material power that they deserve. And of course, the lie of Marxism is exposed whenever you have any communist government. Like, pick your country. People want to leave it. And where do they want to go? They want to go to those nations that are dedicated to the free exchange of goods and services and ideas, and but this relentless attempt to make the government a type of pseudo-church, which is to say a kind of totalizing institution that winds up taking onto itself the responsibilities, the initiatives of other smaller groups of human beings. And of course, this aided by just the technocracy that we live in, that actually needs to be resisted. And so the intermediary institution, for example, of a school, so it's the parents who have the primary right and responsibility to teach their children. The children are not wards of the state until the parents petition the courts to have their children back. No, this is very important. I'll just give one example. There is a book that just came out called The Queering of the American Child, How a New School Religious Cult Poisons the Minds and Bodies of Normal Kids. And we are living in the midst of a deliberate attempt to colonize the minds and actually reconfigure the bodies of children. And the Orwellian language of gender-affirming care just betrays the lie that teaching children to be confused about their own embodiment is not a cultural step forward. And if, for example, government-run schools are being taken over by this ideology, this is not serving the good of families and the stability of the state.
Well, and further, recently in some states, California for one, they don't even have to tell you. The school is in charge of the child, and
Correct.
They don't have to inform you of these things that are going on. So it went from, I'm sending my child to you because I choose to please give me my child back. As you said, that's a dramatic change.
Yes. And the dishonesty of a certain type of the educational establishment in not being honest with parents about this cultural experiment. So the fourth principle can be expressed as those candidates and political parties that would be dedicated to the fostering of intermediate institutions that would care at their lower level for things that the wider government is more and more taking to itself. It's really important support the subsidiarity. Let me give you one other example, another book that just came out from a Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch. The book is called Overruled: The Human Toll of Too Much Law. And he details how even in his own lifetime on the bench of the Supreme Court, the amount of legislation and the federalizing of what governs human life has gotten totally out of control, so that even judges and attorneys don't even know what's on the books and how to apply it wisely. So wherever there's a breakdown in health, there's the multiplication of more and more laws. And more laws are actually not going to fix things. It exacerbates a situation that's actually deeper than legislation or a political fix. So anything that is growing governmental control of ideas, of human life is to be looked on with suspicion.
So that's the intermediary institution principle.
Right.
And then the final, the church herself.
Yeah, because we can't obviously, the end of the discernment actually isn't like, well, we can't trust any single authority, and we can't rely on any single political party or candidate. What are we left with?
Run and hide.
We are left with nothing less than the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is to say, we are left with the communion of persons established by the incarnate Lord of the universe himself. And what does that look like? Looks like the union of the love of God and love of neighbor. And that involves a radical privileging of the local as the best gift that we can give at the state level and ultimately at the national level. So when we're actually living our personal life from the heart of the church, when our family life is actually being informed from the heart of the church, when our love of neighbor, which is to say, and I mean this in the most literal way, the people who live next to us, we are living from the heart of the church. And in the structures of communion, that, by the way, are transnational, I would argue the Catholic Church is the largest, most robust, dare one even say the only fully transnational organization that is living the good life on the ground locally across the planet. When we get to this question, we have to ask which candidates, which political parties are best going to allow the church to be the church. It may sound like an overly simplistic criterion, but yeah, which political regime is going to persecute us less? Let me put it positively. It's not a question of saying which political regime is going to let the church gain the most political power. That totally misses it. Rather, which political candidate, which political program is most going to respect how the church lives in the world, contributes to the good of the nation, and which candidates and political parties constantly seek to restrict that, and even try to substitute for it, try to malign it, and so I want to be crystal clear that the perennial nature of what I'm proposing here is the five criteria, the five objective principles of discernment, are not dancing around like the two names that can't be named, in terms of candidates for the office of the presidency of the United States in the year of our Lord, 2024.
Because this is an evergreen topic. It'll come up again in 4 years.
That's true. And it's actually one that needs to be applied across the board for every single candidate for political office and every single party proposal for the common good. And to see all the other social issues as part of this, I think is really, really important. And I'll just mention one because this has been a focus of my reading. I have started a book by Coleman Hughes, The End of Race Politics. And Coleman Hughes has a podcast, and he is just a very intelligent witness to what we're experiencing is the rise of a kind of racialism of every aspect of human life, just like with the queering of the American child, the sexualizing of every aspect of human life. And to realize that when it comes to the relation of men and women, when it comes to the relation of people of different races, ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, it really is necessary not to succumb to the almost overwhelming temptation to think that it's all about power politics. And this brings us full circle back to the truth, because without the truth, it does become like the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche of just the strong man asserting his or her will over against the weak, and everything becomes a spoils system of artificially apportioning resources rather than starting from the inherent dignity of each human life.
And you've hinted a bit, but I mean, from a very practical standpoint, we're going to take these criteria, put them on an Excel spreadsheet, put the candidates in each column every time we have an election, and sadly, perhaps none of them are going to get perfect scores.
Right.
So,
it's actually not a kind of mechanical calculus. I would think of it more in terms of gardening. So just organically in the again, whether it's a particular political platform or whether it's what a particular candidate has demonstrated over the course of a number of years as to be, what he or she is investing in as priorities. It's going to be an organic discernment of which party or candidate is going to best foster these goods of the truth, the dignity and integrity of each human life, the family as the fundamental cell of society, fostering the proliferation of the intermediate structures of human sociability, and then ultimately, which is going to let the church be the church for the life of the world. And as I said, there are some people who are very dedicated to a particular person. And I know in recent presidential history, there has been the attempt to conceive of certain people as the Messiah. No human being is the Messiah other than Jesus. But I think most people actually vote based on voting against what they perceive as the greater dangers.
Sure.
And so the principles are applicable in that mode of voting.
And then it's often been said, if American Catholics voted as though they were Catholic, our country would look differently. But that tends to suggest everyone would come to the same decision. It seems worth pointing out one could go through this exercise and have a different selection between two good, meaningful people.
Precisely because the Catholic Church, spread as she is across the whole world and in our nation, in every state, the circumstances of the locality are going to differ widely and in 10,000 different ways. And to simply subsume everything under like one presidential candidate is it's irresponsible culturally, because come November 7th, even if everything is super clear, we are going to get up in the morning and have to be social creatures. And we are going to have to carry forward the love of God and the love of neighbor, and that's going to be lived locally, and that's going to depend on institutions like marriage and the raising of families and the socializing of groups beyond technologized individualism. And it's ultimately going to come down to the church as the pilgrim people of God, living in this world, giving everything for the life of this world, but in light of and in the life of the world to come.
The gates of hell or November 6th, neither can
prevail. Thanks be to God.
Amen to that. Well, thank you for this 3-episode series. Maybe we'll do a 4th post-election, after the election instead of after the homily, to maybe talk about what it means.
Sure.
Or what it doesn't mean, maybe more importantly.
Yes.
But thank you, Father.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you, viewers. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, this series of episodes, certainly as much as I've enjoyed participating in it. Are there other things you'd like to hear about? We'd love to know. You can reach us at church@stv.org. You could message me directly if you like, 260-450-8878. If you'd put after the homily in that message, it would be great. But we'd love to hear from you. So thanks for spending some time with us. Please like and share and subscribe and send this podcast to everyone you know. Your viewership helps us make more episodes. So we'll be back again soon with another episode of After the Homily with Father Daniel Schiedt.